Dear all, I have the pleasure to open our meeting. This is the first lecture of the series of 4 lectures entitled Local Communities at the Slavic-Italian-German Borderland. This is a joint project of the Post-Yugoslav Area Research Center at the Institute of Slavic Studies at the University of Warsaw, and of the Institute of Slavic Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. My name is Maciej Falski. I'm from the Institute of Slavic Studies at the university, and I carry on that project with my friend Ewa Wróblewska-Trochimiuk from the Polish Academy of Sciences. At the beginning, I would like to thank a lot the Austrian Forum of Culture for hosting us, for having us here at this wonderful space, especially to Anna Macko, who supported that project from the beginning. Let me introduce our guest, Michaela Wedekinda, researcher who is doing his research on the very interesting and very specific special area at the borderland of the Slavic, German, and Italian cultural area. This is a zone of contact. It used to be the zone of conflict, cooperation, a zone of different identities. We're going to hear, I suppose, some stories from that borderland today. Michal is a researcher who was associated with various universities, in fact, in Italy, in Germany. Now is affiliated at the Central Institute of Art History in München. Michal, I give you the floor.
So good evening to everybody. Thanks again to the organizers for having me invited to this conference entitled Continuities and Discontinuities, Late Habsburg Rule in the Alpine-Adriatic Borderlands and its Aftermath. After Austria had been annexed by Germany in March 1938, Hitler had solemnly disclaimed Sub-Brenner Tyrol on May 7, 1939. 2 weeks before signing the German-Italian Steel Pact. Bilateral negotiations were immediately begun on the future destiny of German South Tyroleans. On June 23, 1939, representatives of the German Reich and a delegation of the Kingdom of Italy, led by Ambassador Attolico, met at the headquarters of the Secret State Police in Berlin. After that decisive conference, headed by Heinrich Himmler, other bilateral meetings followed. It was agreed on repatriating Germans from South Tyrol, as well as from the Canal Valley, which is close to the Austrian and nowadays Slovenian border. Even the Ladinians from the Dolomites were included in the repatriation program, which was finally also extended to the German linguistic exclaves in the province of Trento. The mentioned populations were required to decide individually within a few weeks' time whether to immigrate to Germany or keep Italian citizenship by consigning special ballot papers to the authorities. Massive propaganda exerted by both regimes, however, impeded any independent personal decision. In South Tyrol, approximately 84%, in the Canal Valley, around 86%, among the Ladinians, roughly 40% of the population voted in favor of assuming German citizenship, hence opting for their repatriation to Germany. The fact that only 15% of the German-speaking population of South Tyrol and the Canal Valley opted in favor of keeping the Italian citizenship is interesting enough and raises a series of questions. I would like, however, to draw your attention on those who, for different reasons, were not entitled to vote, but applicated for German citizenship nevertheless. The irregular options of several of them were later enforced by the German authorities or accepted thanks to special agreements. Among them were each 2,100 Italians from Trentino and Slovenes from the Canal Valley, whereas the votes of the Slovenes were accepted after long negotiations with the Italian authorities. Most of the applications from Italian-speaking Trentino were refused. So what were the motives of people who basically had no right whatsoever to be admitted to vote, but who nevertheless voted for German citizenship and thus for their resettlement in the German Reich? In other words, to achieve for themselves, if not a shift in the post-war borders, then a life under German auspices. The question raises even more with regard to the Slovenes of the Canal Valley, especially in view of the anti-Slovenian policy in Austria, which culminated in private settlement measures in southern Carinthia during this interwar period and in the resettlement of the Carinthian Slovenes in 1942. An analog question could be, why was it that in 1920, in a referendum, after armed resistance against the Yugoslav occupation of Lower Carinthia, in a 70% Slovene-speaking zone in the southern part of the country, a clear majority voted in favor of that area remaining with Austria? That, by the way, in 1914, had no difficulties to recruit soldiers from those borderland regions and to have them bravely fighting for the emperor. The answers to this are manifold, referring to the case of South Tyrol, the heinousness of ethnic minorities in fascist Italy, the denial of local autonomies, the hope for more favorable socio-economic conditions in the German Reich, and its massive and massively exaggerated propaganda with its promises of salvation come to mind. Did the image of the old Habsburg monarchy merge with that of the Third Reich? Was it the memories of supposedly better times of the old Austrian rule that worked as a counterweight to the deprivation of feeling at home by the post-war regimes? In a novel by Louis Strenka, who was a famous mountaineer and actor, the protagonist of his novel, immediately after the First World War, unrooted, wanders through Vienna and the new era, which settled disrespectfully on the ruins of power and proclaimed its unheard-of dawn, which possessed nothing that one could admire or even love a little bit. So alien were the actions, so detached even from the ground of its own past, which is kept closed as if it feared the power that emanated from it. End of quotation. In the 1939 citizenship votes, this psychological state of mind certainly played a role, as did the idea of being among the losers of social economic developments. Quantifying this phenomenon on a large scale would turn out that it went far beyond the 5,000 Italians and Slovenes mentioned above, who applicated for being resettled to Germany without any legal basis. An unusual source, the thousands of private letters from South Tyroleans that were read by the censorship authorities of the fascist regime, taken out of circulation, opened, translated in whole or in part into Italian, resealed and returned to the mail, partially confirms this impression. Yet as for the 1939 vote for citizenship, it was only one of the many motives, and certainly only a minor one, regarding those who were born before 1900, that led people to opt for Nazi Germany. In the following, I will try to analyze whether the Habsburg myth played a role also elsewhere in the Alpine-Adriatic region, and to which extent. Yet it is a phenomenon that is hard to grasp since it worked on individual psychology and mindsets. And could Habsburg times really make up for a myth? Or wasn't this myth rather the result of mentally removing many of its problems? I've chosen one example each from the pre-World War I times, the interwar period, and the Second World War. When on September 10th, 1919, the peace treaty with Austria was signed in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, hardly anybody would have been able to precisely locate and circumscribe what today often is referred to as Alpine-Adriatic region. Moreover, in the heated climate of nationalist polarization, nobody would have been inclined to do so, as this would have meant acknowledging togetherness of what was apparently dominated by diversity and had just been torn apart accordingly. Even today, Alpine-Adriatic region is a hazy notion. Defining its geographical borders is an arduous endeavor. However, this relatively recent term is neither derived from geography nor from traditional traffic or economy networks. What instead conjoins the different parts of the region and overarches its ethnic and linguistic heterogeneity in most recent times are common historical experiences, shared cultural imprints and conditional factors. These connections are the legacy of two great powers and their centuries-long reign over the region. The more narrowly circumscribed rule of Venice as the great power of the Adriatic Sea, and Habsburg Austrian controlling Eastern, Central, and Southeastern Europe. Yet it is not a meticulous analysis of the past, nor nuanced interpretations by historians that is generally meaningful to individuals or collectives when envisioning the future. But the idea of a past created within the present, that's to say the use made of the past, the process of course, which often sees historians involved. Soon after 1918, when Austria-Hungary was swept off the stage of world history, as Venice had been roughly 120 years before, a posthumous mythicization of and nostalgia for Habsburg's rule began to emerge in the territories only recently ceded to Italy and newly established Yugoslavia. It spread among ethnic minorities and those who considered the new governance being invasive, oppressive, or at least detrimental to their own aspirations. It was, and sometimes is still, a longing for or an immersion into a better past, as avoidance and rejection of what was perceived as a disappointing present. These culturally sensitive manifestations of social psychology, although highly erratic and volatile, may however help to map the region. Very roughly speaking, the Alpine-Adriatic region is the place where such wavering sentiments and pockets of Austrian remnants endured at least up until the second half of the 20th century. As testified by contemporary reports and autobiographies, this was the case in Austria's former southern Kronlands, Tyrol, Carinthia, Styria, Carniola, and the Austrian littoral, comprising Gorizia, Gradisca, Trieste, and Istria, as well as in neighboring Friuli, Austrian until 1866. An area thus stretching from the Eastern Alps and the southern forelands to the Istrian Peninsula and to where the confusing Adriatic archipelagos of the Quarner Gulf and Dalmatia begin. A unique European crossroads of languages, cultures, Romanic, Germanic, Slavic, home to several minor ethnic linguistic groups: Ladins, Friulians, Istriots, Istro-Romanians, scattered German linguistic enclaves in Trentino, Friuli, and nowadays Slovenia, as well as to ethnic and national minorities that, depending on border changes, kept changing throughout history. Repeated redrawing of boundaries, building and enforcing state loyalties, inventions of new group identities, together with processes of segregation and exclusion along ethnic, racial, biological, religious, or social criteria, are key characteristics of the region's 20th century history. It is a history of contested belongings and contested identities, of concatenated attempts aiming at modifying political power structures, and even beyond 1945, at profoundly changing the population's ethnic and social composition. For much of the century, it is a history of violence, with 2 world wars using the region as one of their theaters, with mass resettlement programs and expulsions, with hitherto unheard of aggressiveness against those structures and components of society which had been identified as being obstacles to what radical totalitarian ideologies of the epoch defined as human progress. The destiny of the region's Jewish population is just one example. The German police internment and extermination camp Risiera di San Sabba in Trieste is a symbol testifying to this spiral of violence. Yet the dimensions of violence and suffering that characterize much of Eastern European history, and I think this is important to stress, have no direct parallels in the Alpine-Adriatic region. So I would very much stress this point of different qualities of aggressiveness, of socio-political interventions when reshaping the territory and its people. The decades around 1900 had turned the area, formerly a region of cultural encounter, into an area of ethnic, cultural, socio-economic and political clashes. Even after the Iron Curtain had fallen, or actually because of it, this part of Europe long remained a region of people on the move, or all too often of people on the run. With the official dissolution of Austria-Hungary and the redrawing of borders in the Alpine-Adriatic region, most of the Slovene-speaking territories were unified for the first time in history within the same administrative context, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. However, a substantial part of the Slovenian population settling locally in ethnically mixed areas remained outside the new state borders. At the same time, the territorial reconfiguration created new minority issues. In the years to come, they were worsened by the oppression of ethnic minorities and by denationalization and resettlement programs in both Italy and Yugoslavia, causing multiple migration flows. Slovenes and Croats left Italy, the Julian March, for the Americas, Western Europe and Yugoslavia, where they were partly resettled in ethnically mixed regions. Germans from Carniola, Lower Styria, and to a minor degree from South Tyrol left for Austria. Italians from Yugoslavia, especially from Dalmatia, immigrated to the Italian possessions on the Dalmatian coast, especially to Zadar. Soon after the war, armed struggles broke out over disputed borders. They concerned both the Austro-Yugoslav and the Italo-Yugoslav boundaries. The conflict between Yugoslav and irregular Carinthian troops regarding control over predominantly Slovene-speaking southern Carinthia started in January 1919 and was resolved with the plebiscite on October 10th, 1920. The latter decided in favor of southern Carinthia remaining part of Austria, thus confirming the Saint-Germain borders. However, the Italo-Yugoslav border issue over the ethnically mixed city of Rijeka, claimed by both Italy and Yugoslavia, led to a first revision of the borders established. In 1924, Yugoslavia had to accept the city being annexed by Italy. However, the 1938 Anschluss of Austria was the first major border exchange in the Alpine-Adriatic region, and the 1939 resettlement program concerning South Tyrol was the first major reconfiguration of its ethnic border. The Second World War, however, brought about much more radical changes of both the region's geopolitical and ethnic structure. Between 1922 and 1933-34, all countries of the Alpine-Adriatic region turned from democracy towards dictatorship. After Italy, where Benito Mussolini was appointed prime minister of a right-wing coalition government in October 1922, assuming complete dictatorial powers in 1926, Yugoslavia was to follow in 1929. Last not least, in Austria, Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss assumed dictatorial powers in March 1933, just a few weeks after Nazi leader Adolf Hitler had come into power in Germany. So let's step to the first example I wanted to show you, taken from still Habsburg times. Those who traveled to the Fasse Valley at the turn of the century, to Ledin Campitello, the then most important tourist center in the valley, found themselves having to choose between the Agnello and the Mulino for their hotel accommodations. Both hotels served as a base for excursions into the nearby Dolomite ranges and accommodated an elite of guests attracted by the uniqueness of mountain landscape. The international tourist interest of the two hotels was evidenced, if for no other reason than the frequent reports in guidebooks and various mountaineering association periodicals. Which of the two establishments to give preference to, however, represented a decision that was not always easy to take. If the Molino was rated only sufficient by the magazine of the Club Alpin Français, according to the German Baedeker guidebook, it was among the praised hotels, while the bulletin of the Austria-German Alpine Club emphasized the cheating character of the owner. The Agnello, for its part, was rated simple by the Baedeker, yet exquisite by the magazine of the Swiss Alpine Club, which praised its cuisine and in particular its excellent risotto and its Moscatello wine. Where to stay then? At the Agnello or at the Mulino? Far from yielding to the flattery of the culinary art or to the praise of the Baedeker guide, for Wilhelm Rohmeder, an important leader of the German Völkisch Associationism, there was no question that the German tourist should prefer the latter because of the pro-German sentiments of its owner. For the same reason, the Agnello had to be avoided, as its owner was considered close to pro-Italian nationalist circles. Starting in 1903, the magazine Alldeutsche Blätter published at the beginning of each summer season special warnings addressed to the German traveler heading to Tyrol. In a sense, Rohmeder warned tourists against frequenting Italian or pro-Italian establishments in order to support Germandom in the Austrian border regions, which he considered aggrieved and overwhelmed. We may be sure that Rohmeder himself felt it to be a moral obligation to turn away from the Agnello and its wines. But was that true also for his readers and German tourists in general? Was his advice shared to the point that German travelers would resist the lure of gastronomic delicacies? Was it possible to subordinate leisure and holiday to ethnic loyalty? In other terms, could the boundary separating the public and private spheres be removed? Was it possible to make the tourist a soldier of the national cause? Respecting an appeal made not by state institutions, but by private associations, unrelated to political parties and administrative bodies? It is doubtful and equally well-founded to believe that at the time Romeda himself placed little faith in the immediate and general success of such initiatives. What then were the real goals of his calls for a boycott? The nationalization of the traveler and the ethnization of tourism prompt several further reflections. Why did Central European nationalist circles, whether German, Italian or Slavic, identify tourism as a political means to be used for the cause of the nation? The historiography on nationalism agrees that the construction of national identity is as much a social operation as it is a cultural one, and that the latter, in addition to appealing to language, revolves mainly around the interpretation of the notions of time and space, focusing on cultural historical diversity. The backdrop for it is nature or landscape, which are also subject to a process of nationalization, of symbolic occupation and of attributing imaginary meanings, crucial for the development of identity concepts. How then was the national conquest of the territory operated? What were the new sites to be visited, and what discursive and symbolic function did they play in what has been called identity tourism? And to return to the example of the Fassa Valley, what did it imply for the tourist that the Baedeker guidebook in 1910 marked a clear and almost tangible boundary in Little Campitello by calling the Molina Hotel German and the Agnello Italian, even though among the locals, a 100% Ladin-speaking population, such a distinction was not at all familiar. And finally, what were the effects of the politicalization of the tourism industry? We will not be able to answer not even the most important questions. However, I'd like to give you at least some hints on how much such strategies contributed to draw new mental boundaries. The political use of private social practices, such as tourism, sports, mountaineering, are part of the complex and contradictory process of nationalizing Central European societies between the 19th and 20th centuries. In the Austrian Empire, this process contrasted with the country's modernizing and centralizing process, and with the strengthening of the Habsburg dynastic patriotism. Nation building among the various ethnic groups of the Austrian Empire saw social forces at work that didn't gain any access to the state apparatus and thus to the classic organs of socialization, such as the army, educational institutions, etc. A key role in their national identity building was therefore assumed by various nationalist associations, created specifically as subsidiary means. Although founded in urban centers by members of the middle classes, they carried out their action in rural areas and particularly on the ethnic linguistic boundary, considered to be a semiotic expression of the nation. Ethnocentric interpretations and visions of elements such as landscape, culture, and history were at the heart of national identity building. They were also determinants in the practice of tourism, which soon became a means for intensifying the process of building up ethnic awareness. Heritage became the place where tourism and nationalism converged. One of the privileged physical and cultural spaces for this convergence was the ethno-linguistic border. What mattered in this context was not so much succeeding in directly influencing the behavior and choice of the individual, but acting socially at the level of mass psychology to anchor in the consciousness of individuals the idea of borders and of claiming territories for the own nation. The importance of this operation, based on ethnic and historical cultural concepts, lay in the internalization of identity models and in the constitution of ethnic communities, in drawing new mental maps, and in achieving a new collective perception of territory and landscape. The architects of this process were those patriotic elites who made tourism and its literature one of their vehicles for spreading strong national appeal. An important element of this operation was the attempt to construct a specific identity for the disputed borderland regions, an identity model that was even tried to position as a tourist brand, an identity in connection with and in continual reference and appeal to the entire nation. In Tyrol, we can identify two contrasting efforts. The Italian one focused its attention on urban life and civic values, taking inspiration rather from the traditions of the ancient Italian city republics. Italian nationalist associations did not succeed in elaborating an alpine ethno-landscape as effective as that of their German counterparts. Austro-German nationalists were able instead to elevate rural populations and their traditions not only to a tourist attraction, but also to a symbolic expression of national identity. The ethnicization of tourism in the late Habsburg monarchy placed the different national bourgeoisies, as well as the territorial identity designs, in competition, a process which for some promoters, sometimes future exponents of the post-war dictatorial regimes, served as the first stage and as a test laboratory for a broader nationalization of the masses. I would like to give you a short other example, always from the same period, regarding tourism on Lake Garda. On the morning of Saturday, June 23rd, 1889, at 11 a.m., a party of about 500 excursionists from Milan and Brescia arrived in Riva del Garda, aboard a steamer of an Italian shipping and railway society. The excursionists scampered through the streets of the town and then stopped under the windows of the palace of the Imperial Royal District Captaincy and burst into shouts praising Garibaldi, Italy, and the Italian-speaking areas of Austria, which had soon to be liberated and annexed to Italy. We should perhaps refer to this map, which shows you the state border between Austria-Hungary and Italy. The northern part at that period was Austrian territory, whereas the southern part belonged to Italy. And so these excursionists we're talking about arrived from the southern part of the lake, traveling north to Austrian Riva. Already in the past, in fact, local Habsburg authorities had repeatedly complained about a series of provocations: the failure to display the Austrian flag on Italian boats once they entered the territorial waters of the empire, the intonation upon departure from Riva of the royal march or the hymn to Garibaldi by the bands accompanying the sailors, the fraternization between Italian nationalists from Habsburg Trentino and those from Italy, and the display of the daisy, the flower symbol of the Queen of Italy, by excursionists from Italy heading to villages situated on the shores of the Austrian part of the lake. In July 1888, at Riva, an Italian marching band arrived dressed in plain clothes and, having deposited their musical instruments aboard the boat, went ashore with the excursionists as a group of private persons. The stay of the group took place without the slightest incident, but at the hour of departure, once everybody had embarked, the band suddenly appeared in full uniform on the foredeck and attacked the so-called Royal Italian March, to the sounds of which the ship left the port. These episodes were the classic straw that broke the camel's back. In short, in 1889, the local Austrian authorities had lost the taste for spring and summer hiking on Lake Garda. In fact, when at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of June 23rd, the Lombard group was departed, the unnerved district captain decided to suspend by special decree the excursions organized by the following Saturday by a group from Italy. The ban on weekend steam excursions constituted, however, an economic detriment to the merchants of Riva. Indeed, the latter were deprived by an additional influx of 400 to 500 excursionists every weekend, who were added to the number of guests arriving by regular line boats. Nonetheless, the ban was confirmed by high-ranking Austrian authorities and they prohibited Sunday outings for the entire following years as well. What troubled the Austrian authorities was evidently not the economic implication, but rather the problem of how to manage a bold and undisciplined Sunday public, keen, according to the competent authorities, to political provocation, especially if in contact with the numerous local anti-Austrian elements. Prohibition or not, in the light of a report of the Imperial Royal Military Authorities drawn up almost 20 years after the events narrated, we can guess how the Austrian struggle against irredentist demonstrations related to excursions on Lake Garda rather took form of Don Quixote. Austrian authorities appear to have been unable to stop such provocations. What added to their annoyance was the fact that similar episodes occasionally took part in the presence of members of the Habsburg family. Rudderless in my boat, traveling with the wind that blows in the basest regions of death, wrote Franz Kafka in 1917 in the novel fragment The Hunter, set in Riva, where the author had stayed in 1909 and again in 1913. The novel fragment appears to be a critique of a society that would shortly thereafter experience one of its greatest catastrophes. A metaphor for this is the boat at the mercy, we would add, of a heated nationalism driven by the deadly wind of war towards the chasm of Sarajevo bombing. A second example of borderland concepts I chose is taken from the interwar period and the Italian-Yugoslav boundary. Since the late 19th century, knowledge, methods, and instruments for a complex redesign of society and of the human environment, including genetic perfection, had been available. The rational planning of the future according to a supposedly ideal image of man and society became the basis of governmental thought and action and a key signature of the 20th century. The experiences of the First World War and the Great Depression caused skepticism towards the comprehensive planning of man's destiny and environment to recede into the background in many cases. Instead, the planning anticipation of the future appeared to be an adequate response to the manifest crisis of modernity. Against the backdrop of this optimism and belief in progress, the question of the harmony of planning on the one hand and freedom on the other receded, especially under the emerging totalitarian regimes whose interventions to enforce comprehensive large-scale concepts to reorganize the composition of populations and their territories were characterized by pure violence. The victims of these complex forms of physical, structural, and cultural violence, which characterized the era of world wars and dictatorships, were above all ethnic, religious, racial, and social minorities of Central and Eastern Europe. In this respect, the Alpine-Adriatic region was no exception. The repeated territorial reorganizations with their subsequent administrative, institutional, and political adjustments during the first half of the 20th century were radically reflected in expansive population policy projects through ethnic assimilation and denationalization, resettlement or relocation, and deportation of parts of the population. In this context, it is necessary to ask about the general political, socio-economic and cultural enabling context, as well as the specific social conditions that made far-reaching reorganizations of the population and social structure appear necessary, desirable, or at least justifiable. What was the theoretical background? What was the genesis of these reorganization interventions? What specific role did the cultural, social, and health sciences play in the empirical measurement, inventory, and description of the population and its components? To what extent were they involved in the development of knowledge, of power, and in particular, in the provision of databases, guiding principles, and planning for social, population, and spatial planning concepts, or even in their realization? What research programs were set up in this regard, and what funding practices were pursued? What influence were the scientific milieus able to exert on political decision makers? And what was the relationship between the functional elites of the administration and those with political responsibility? What determined their respective interests and backgrounds for action? What is crucial in this context is the role policy advisors had and the use made of expert knowledge by governments, politicians, authorities, and non-governmental organizations. All this had a direct and immediate impact on local societies and their daily life. In interwar Italy, numerous research projects and investigations were carried out that were interested in socio-economic and ethnopolitical aspects. Among them were the series of provincial agrarian registers compiled on behalf of the Central Italian Institute of Statistics, which offered detailed studies and statistics on local conditions of agriculture, forestry, and pasture farming, as well as on the socio-economic conditions of the rural population. The research was carried out by the Cattedre Ambulanti di Agricoltura, an important institution of agricultural education and research. Since the end of the 1920s, they had been engaged in the development of strategies aimed at the nationalization and assimilation of ethnic minorities in the border areas through a combination of socio-economic and ethnopolitical interventions: land reclamation, reforestation, reorganization of public land uses, agrarian reforms, land transformations, expropriations, displacement of local population, and repopulation measures. Our example comes from the local institution based in Gorizia, which in 1932 presented a study for the land transformation of the Collio, which is an area near to Gorizia, nowadays border city close to the Slovenian border. The project was part of a much broader catalogue aimed at profoundly changing the ethnic composition of the predominantly slave population along the entire eastern border of Italy, from the Alps to Istria. These programs, mostly developed by forestry experts based on statistical and rural sociology, provided for similar interventions on the Upper Gorizia region, the Vipaco Valley, the Postjugosłowiańskiego district, and the karst area of Monte Nevoso. A series of socio-economic measures as means of fascist ethnopolitics indeed led to several tens of thousands of Slovenes and Croats immigrating from what then was called the Julian March. They left for Western Europe and overseas, but mainly to Yugoslavia. There are still no reliable figures on Slovenian immigration. More recent accounts put them at 50,000. In 1941, however, the German occupation authorities estimated that around 40 to 50,000 people had immigrated from the Italian dominion to Yugoslavia alone since 1918, out of which around 30,000 of them to Lower Styria. We need to stress, however, that the post-war establishment of new spatial and state administrative systems and the harassment of ethnic minorities by Yugoslavia triggered ongoing migration processes that ran parallel to socio-economically induced internal and immigration movements. On the one hand, parts of the German population left Caniola and Lower Styria. At the same time, under state and economic pressure, numerous Hungarians, including a number of Hungarian Jews as a result of growing anti-Semitism, migrated from the eastern parts of Slovenia to Hungary. The destinations of those who left Italy were mostly the larger towns in Slovenia: Ljubljana, Maribor, Kranj, Celje, Novo Mesto, Ptuj, and Chernomil. In Maribor, immigrations from the Julian March were apparently able to compensate for the German population losses. In addition, Italian immigrants were resettled to Prekmurje and in parts to Lower Styria, where the Yugoslav agrarian reform led to the expropriation of non-Slovenian large landowners, in particular due to the existing ownership structure between 1921 and 1932. Several settlement colonies were established in mixed Slovene-Hungarian-speaking border strips in the eastern and southeastern Prekmurje region. In Lower Styria, immigrants from the Vipavska Valley were able to take over an increasing number of former German property in the immediate vicinity of Maribor at the end of the 1920s. Also upstream, the Drava River and north up to the Austrian border, that is on the well-known axis of ethnic struggle during the late Habsburg monarchy, farms were transferred to Slovenes from Italy. In the German settlement areas of Mursko and Apaszko-Polje, on the other hand, farms passed to immigrants from the surplus birth regions of the Prekmurje area. In some cases, Slovenes and Croats from the Julian March were also settled in Croatia and Serbia, while Belgrade agricultural and settlement authorities transferred others to areas of ethnic tensions in the south of Yugoslavia. So those people leaving Italy under the pressure of the fascist regime were made instruments of Yugoslav or Slovene ethnic politics. Generally speaking, without having been able to get into more details here, we may affirm, based on archival evidence, that scholarly elites and experts, state bureaucracy and executing authorities highly contributed to transforming the Alpine-Adriatic region, traditionally an area of cultural context and exchanges, into an area of persistent socio-ethnic conflicts, and that even after 1945. So my third example is to follow. This is the last one. In the backwash of the Balkan War of April 1941, and subsequently after the German occupation of Italy, in September 1943, the Third Reich realized a lesser-known expansionist strategy that focused on the annexation of provinces south of its 1938 former Austrian border. In both cases, the underlying political design had been launched and successfully advocated by leading circles of Austrian National Socialists. Even though no definite concepts of the future status of the occupied territories had previously been worked out, the expansionist model was integrated into the general dispositions concerning German domination of Yugoslavia and 2 years later of Italy. Herewith, a political strategy was realized that can be regarded as a pointed imperialist derivation from expansive pre-1918 Austrian borderland designs and later revisionist aspirations. A strategy that, as far as Italy was concerned, had been inhibited until 1943 by the National Socialist leadership and its political and military alliance with fascist Italy. In the course of the territorial dismantling of Yugoslavia by the Axis powers and their allies in 1941, Germany had reclaimed the northern area of Slovenia leaving its southern part to Italy and conceding to Hungary a small district on the left bank of the Mura River. This cordon of semi-annexed provinces was accomplished in 1943, when Italy, after the armistice with the Western Allies, was widely occupied by German troops. Whereas most of the country was placed under military administration, German civil administration, that makes a big difference, was introduced into the so-called operational zones of the Prealps and of the Adriatic littoral, situated in the area between Lake Garda and Rijeka. The National Socialist occupation regimes installed in the bordering provinces of Yugoslavia and Italy showed great similarities. Although not formally annexed, the occupied territories were subordinated to the sovereignty of the Reich, albeit to very different extents. The administration was headed by the highest-ranking party exponents of the neighboring German regions, namely by the respective party leaders and regional representatives of the Reich, in the present case of Tyrol and Carinthia. The ethnic structure of these regions was rather heterogeneous. As for the Adriatic littoral, Italians were dominating, followed by Slovenes, Friulians, and Croatians. With the more or less overt annexation of these territories, the Third Reich expanded into an area that had mostly been a centuries-long Habsburg dominion. In the last decades of Austrian rule, it was the seat of heavy ethnic conflicts over socio-economic potentials, national emancipation, and regional autonomies, conflicts in which the Germans, as the most influential nationality of the monarchy, attempted to safeguard acquired privileges by means of ever more offensive and aggressive strategies, often mitigated or stopped, however, by the Austrian authorities. Characterized by profound political mobilization and nationalization, these ethnic clashes, in which traditional forms of supernatural identification, solidarity, and discipline were increasingly replaced by ethnocentric patterns of group identity and loyalty, had a decisive influence on the growth of national intolerance in the region. The conflict was aggravated even more by the collective experiences of World War I, which since 1915 had had its theatre in the Tyrolean Dolomites, in the Carnian and Julian Alps, and especially along the Isonzo River. The aftermath of the war, the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, heavy territorial losses, the inclusion of some 380,000 borderland Germans into Italy and Yugoslavia, the military and propagandistic struggle for southern Carinthia, as well as the oppression of German minorities by Yugoslavia and the fascist regime in Italy, not only produced deep disappointment and damaged the German sentiment of national superiority, but also widely resulted in a radicalization of political thought, reinforced xenophobia, and incited revenge. Beyond revisionist claims and internal resettlement programs in ethnic mixed or non-German areas of Carinthia, Styria, and the Burgenland, genuine Austrian imperialist concepts regarding the Alpine and Adriatic area had emerged since the 1920s. Actually, the claim to the southeastern Alpine foreland, to access to the Adriatic Sea, to establishing German hegemony in Central Europe in order to expand to East Central and Southeast Europe, was a remake of traditional pre-1918 models. The Second World War opened a window of opportunities for reorganization of the ethnic and political configuration of the territory. Although precise interventions were postponed until the end of the war, measures to be taken had already been contemplated since the beginning of the German occupation. Nazi rule in the Adriatic littoral was to legitimize by a series of geopolitical and economic, historic, ethnic, and political reasons, while individual identities for the different regions and nationality groups were to be designed. Scholarly publications on the subject, as well as the German propaganda, instigated and supported centrifugal aspirations in the region. They followed a strategy of ethnic segmentation and antagonism. the ethnic complexity of the region was to minimize the legitimacy of Italian supremacy, additionally called into question by affirming the complete failure of fascist minority policy. As the Deutsche Adria-Zeitung pointed out, Germany was destined to succeed as a stabilizing power and called upon to establish a new order. A booklet on Istria published in 1943 stated, "In the borderland of races and peoples, of languages and cultures, it is extremely difficult to trace a frontier line which is fair in terms of nationality and in the meantime satisfactory from a military as well as a political and economic point of view. Therefore, it was good fortune that for nearly a millennium, German state systems assumed the function of a stabilizing power and that German lords and nobles encouraged the economic and administrative development of the country." Alluding to the medieval German Empire and the Habsburg monarchy, scholarly experts and SS-guided German propaganda paid special attention to the historic development of Trieste. It was pointed out that Trieste owes its rise exclusively to the union with Austria. If it had remained under Venetian rule, it would have continued to be a small city as the Istrian towns did. Venice had no interest in the rise of Trieste. On this issue, Carinthian historians constructed a continuity of economic antagonism that had features of National Socialist Großraumwirtschaft, economy of great spaces, and of the new European order, which would restore access to the traditional hinterland of Trieste, lost in 1918, and again bring the city new economic prosperity. The centrifugal but mutually antagonistic regional and ethnic aspirations promoted in this way were intended to convey the impression that the border issue in northeast Italy were once again open. They were intended to gain public acceptance for a territorial reconfiguration and the intervention of the Reich as a regulatory power in the emerging conflicts. Nazi propaganda therefore highlighted historical models that had supposedly corresponded as far as possible to local particularism, but had also had a special relationship to the German cultural area. The Habsburg era was associated with numerous collective imaginations that could be used in the German interest. In many cases, the dual monarchy stood for a less repressive, more efficient administrative management that was opposed to the malgoverno of fascism and an overall more tolerant nationality policy. It was associated with the respect for traditional culture, economic, legal, and administrative regionalism, the reminiscence of limited autonomies, and the integration and interdependence into the Central European economic area, which was associated with economic prosperity. This Habsburg myth was primarily a bundling of nostalgic longings, and especially where anti-German sentiments persisted, by no means necessarily an articulation of pro-German attitudes. Few states and cultures have left such a deep and indelible mark in the memory as the Habsburg monarchy. The national conflicts of the post-war period, reinforced especially in the German-speaking territories that had passed under foreign rule, the old supranational Habsburg myth. Indeed, the more turbulent the European situation became in the interwar years, the stronger the mourning and memories of the old Habsburg times came to the fore. Since the strengthening of the Third Reich, the disillusionment and frustration, not only in the annexed German-speaking territories, had often adopted a nostalgic view of the world, labeled Austriacantismo by fascism, which transferred the positive connotation of Austrian rule to National Socialism and even saw it the bearer of hope for specific regional aspirations. Propaganda in the operational zones by Germany attempted to project these feelings and the memories of Austria, which had previously always been degraded by National Socialism onto German occupation. It was associated with the style of government and mentality of the Austro-Hungarian administration. Existing expectations were thus to be transformed into active collaboration, or at least into a benevolent predisposition towards the occupying regime. The Habsburg illusion was fed by the designation to the Adriatic littoral of former Austrian administrative staffs. The economic interests of Trieste, considered to be linked to Central Europe, as well as the territorial reorganization of the occupation zones, referred to Habsburg memories and echoes of old Austrian nationality, especially Austrian nationality politics, thus disguising the ethnic intolerance of National Socialism. Above all, it was the German-controlled mass media that sought to evoke the climate of old Austria and construct continuity with the Nazi administration. The Trieste radio program, which opened in the morning with the absurd Trieste ride e si diverte, Trieste laughs and has fun, intoned a danse macabre, as it resented a surreal world of unadulterated cheerfulness, operetta and Viennese waltz atmosphere. The offer of a shallow, upbeat escape from reality, the deeper intention of which was manifested in the program item, "Who wants to build up must be happy," was combined with the clearly instrumentalized recourse to old ties between Trieste and Vienna, to the fin de siècle attitude to life in the Danube metropolis, whose supposed splendor Radio Adriatic littoral sought to spread. Viennese charm and a wine tavern atmosphere, a sort of heurigen Mut, the broadcaster's evening's greetings, Trieste saluta Vienna, Wien grüßt Trieste, also concealed the true face of the repressive German occupation. The press focused on Trieste's historical relations with Austria and the Central European culture and economic area that recalled Emperor Charles VI, who had made Trieste the harbor of the empire and established the free port of the city. Under the title Fates Around Miramare, Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian and his wife were commemorated. The relations of Winkelmann, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Ricarda Huch with Trieste were recalled. Austria memories were also associated with a latent criticism of Italian and specifically fascist rule. Fascism was accused of failing to solve the social and ethnic problems in the Julian March. The press publicly criticized the Italian leadership for having been far less efficient and correct than the Habsburg administration. The suggestion of the lifestyle of the turn of the century and the cosmopolitan atmosphere of old Trieste proved to be a deceptive illusion. They concealed the difference between the rule of the Austrian monarchy and that of Nazi dictatorship. As a matter of fact, Miramare Castle was no longer an archducal nid d'amoureux, but a training center for National Socialist senior officers. Duino Castle, where Rilke had once worked on his Duino elegies, was now home to the Waffen-SS partisan combat school. In Trieste born Odilo Lothar Gublocznik, who in Poland had established his reputation as an, quotation from a Nazi contemporary, unrivaled bloodhound, whose career led him from Berets, Sobibor, and Treblinka concentration camps to the Risiera di San Sabba in Trieste, was now the second powerful Nazi representative on the upper Adriatic. Generally speaking, I've been referring to very ephemeral phenomena of states of minds, of individual psychology. I will guess that we will have big difficulties in showing a strict continuity in, or even a legacy of Austrian feelings, which are not part of this kind of instrumentalizing Habsburg memories for political uses. Sharp new laws were introduced, new administrations introduced after 1918, with the successor states involved in rebuilding or in building up a proper identity. What I would individuate in the examples given, starting from a not so peaceful Austrian reality during the last decades, and social, political and ethno-political interventions in the successor states, is a legacy which is hard to find. I mean, hard to really introduce into numbers or quantify. But this could be a topic of discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you a lot, Michal, for your so inspiring lecture, full of ideas, full of topics and examples. For me, it was mostly the history of borders existing mentally before the First World War, borders existing politically, introduced with every new regime in this area, as we could see on one of pictures you show us. Every generation had its own new political order in the area. We have time for discussion. We have time left for discussion. So I encourage you to ask questions, to give your comments on this very rich material we've heard. Take this opportunity.
Robert Zydel, thank you for your speech. I think that the borderlands are very complicated, not only in Poland, because sometimes we think that our history is very complicated, but in the other part of Europe or world. I have no question, and I would like to share with you one story from Santa Croce. Santa Croce is a small village north to the Trieste, and there's like 2,000 inhabitants, and there is a minority of Slovenian people. 2 years ago, I visited this city, and the local leader, Slovenian, showed me this town and small museum, mostly focused on the Martimar and fishing, not about the roots, ethnicity of the inhabitants. But during the tour in the village, he showed me one building, stone, and he asked me, "You know what is this building?" No idea. This is the first school in our village, and it was established by Maria Teresa during the Habsburg time. And he was very proud that in this city was this school. And he told me that the education in our village come from Habsburg, not from Italian. And I think that this is some kind of an example for your test about the nostalgic for Habsburg Empire and this myth of Habsburg in this region. Thank you.
Just a very short comment on this. That area you have been talking about passed under Italy only in 1918. So Italy had no opportunity to build any school in that area. Yeah,
but in his story, this Habsburg were better than Italian. He was the citizen of Italy. And the other story was he looks stereotypical like Italian, handsome, sunglasses, good car. But he told me, you know why my name is Francesco? No idea. Because during the war, he was born in 40s, it was impossible to name kids by Slavic names, only Italian. So I think it's it's very difficult when you are not able to name your kid in the tradition of your culture. So I think that the story about school was the story against Italy, but in a very polite way.
One problem of these areas is the fact that when they passed under Italy, there were just 2 years left under democracy, on an unstable democracy. So most areas annexed by Italy in 1918 witnessed Italy in its fascist expression, I mean in rude anti-minority policies. And this is probably what people keep in mind and refer positive aspects to previous periods, in that case to Austria and to long ago Maria Theresa.
I wanted to ask two things. You mentioned several times Austrian nationality, Austrian identification. My first question is, does it refer to Habsburg monarchy? Because as I understand, I'm not sure as it works like this, that Austrian identity, different than German, is from the end of the Second World War. Am I right?
Yes, slightly, I'd say.
Slightly, because yeah. Okay, yeah, because I recall. I don't know if good Polish comedy from 1980s, Imperial Royal Deserters, where there is a whole army consisting all nationalities living in Habsburg monarchy, and there is an order to sing the anthem, and no one knows anthem. So, Hungarians show up, Poles show up, Bosniaks show up, and everyone. Austrians, and nobody shows up. So it seems we have no Austrians. And this sub-officer, let's say, told, let me notice that we are all Austrians. And then was a question, so why no one showed up? So my question is double, let's say, but were there any efforts in the late Habsburg monarchy to create some general identity over German, Hungarian, Czech, Polish, etc., like British one, let's say, or maybe Yugoslav, like Slovenian, Serb, but over it there was Yugoslav identity, or it was so strong that there wasn't one. And in the end, I wanted to ask about Gorica. This photograph in Gorica with this border, not so iron. Is it in this central square of Gorizia?
It might be in the outskirts of the city, because the city itself remained under Italy after 1945. Just the station, the railway station, passed under Yugoslavia, which built up a new Gorizia, Nova Gorica.
Nova Gorica, yeah.
Yeah. And as to the different identities of, or identity building, Austrian, let's say, identity building, I think we must differentiate. I've been mostly talking about ethnic minorities building up their own identity. I may just give you another example, which for reasons of time I didn't present. The national organizations and associations founded by these ethnic minority groups generally had organized meetings, and as a rule, an Austrian police officer had to be present at these meetings, giving a report afterwards to the local authorities, which then was handed up to the superior authorities. And there are different reports on these meetings. In one of them, this police officer stated the population wasn't really aware what this meeting was about. They didn't really get the idea of nationalism, of nation building. But, and this is more or less a precise quotation, they had the impression that it was a carnival event. And in the second report, it is said people had the idea it was a kind of lottery. So these ideas coming from the city, from a middle class, didn't really ground, I think, in most of the territory, among most of the population. It was a kind of bourgeois, of a middle class invention or action taking place. This is one aspect, the building up of identities among national minorities. Although sometimes, as the Italians, they had very strong position within the Habsburg Empire. The other one is, let's say, a dynastic, overarching general, let's say, Austrian, all the Austrian special often is referred to, let's say, the German-speaking area of the region. But this identity was built, let's say, focusing on the emperor, on the dynasty, on the army. Just one example, we will find this Schönbrunn yellow painting, which is typical for Austrian official authority buildings. Every school building in former Austria had this specific color, which is a very basic example, but generally it was grouped around this dynastic idea around the army, where a lot of minorities and different population groups came together, and the emperor. Did I succeed in more or less
I don't think there is a proper answer for such wide questions, but it is satisfying for me, really. Thank you. Okay. I can share with you an example about this emperor patriotism, let's say, from Polish part of Austrian Empire, let's say Galician, Lodomerian. Grandma of my friend from Nowy Sącz, I don't remember the German name of the city, but yeah, she was born for sure after Austro-Hungarian rule, but it is so different in terms of, let's say, partitioners of Poland, because you can still meet pictures of Franz der Kaiser paintings on the walls, which surprises us from the other parts of Poland. And grandma of this, my friend, still knows how to sing the anthem, Gott erhalte, Gott beschütze. But I'm not sure if it was in Austrian or the Polish version. But yeah, so yeah. That is what I knew, that this kind of loyalty or patriotism to monarchy, to Austrian rule was something aside ethnic or national patriotism, which was Polish, obviously. Or not always, obviously, but yeah, it's not overlapping. As I'm trying to understand those people, because it's like easy to examine because we speak the same language, we are the same nation, but the perception of those times is quite different from people from this southern part, from Galicia.
Mm. Yeah. But as I remembered in my speech, Austria had no problems to recruit soldiers from these difficult border areas. There were just a few hundred Italians from Trentino, from Italian-speaking Tyrol, that crossed the borders and fought with the Italian army, which afterwards, created a kind of problem to the Italian authorities once they took over power in southern Tyrol and Trentino. How to treat those who had been fighting, let's say, for the emperor. So there were different grades of refusal, let's say, towards these groups which had been, well, until the very last moment, loyal to the dynasty.
Thank you very much.
Sorry if you already mentioned it during your lecture and I missed it, but can you share your perspective? Why were the borders not revised after the Second World War?
Well, they had been partially revised and fundamentally...
Galicia, yes, you're right, but like the Trieste, Trentino, Tyrol,
yes,
not, I think.
No, that area, no. Well, this is... has to be seen, I think, on the background of the upcoming so-called Cold War. And, well, parts of the US administration in Italy had been in favor of handing South Tyrol back to Austria. But very soon, this was an idea which had very soon been abandoned. And the Western Allies agreed upon keeping South Tyrol under Italy. Generally, the explanation is given by not creating inner conflicts within, let's say, Western Europe or among those countries which found themselves after 1945 within the Western Allied controlled zones. The process of the eastern border, of the Italian eastern border, is a very long one, which was established, finally acknowledged only in 1975, I think, by the Treaty of Osimo. And well, you have very small territories which Italy was forced to cede to France, but this is a different aspect.
I have two questions. First one related with your third example of using the Habsburg past, Habsburg legacy by the Nazis. So the place of the Habsburg legacy in the Nazi ideology, because it was really surprising for me, because when I think about Nazi ideology, it's I think it must have been hyper-nationalist, and within that idea of German nation, I would say Austria should have a negative image. So it was surprising how to manage that the opposite views over that Habsburg past. So it's the first one.
Well, you're completely right. National Socialists have always criticized Austria, the monarchy, as they did criticize Italy for keeping the monarchy. And whereas in Germany there was just one Führer, whereas in Italy you had both the king and Mussolini. Well, since more or less the 1880s, you have in Austria a tendency of splitting up the country. The east, or the German-speaking areas of Austria joining the new German Empire. Schönerer was one of them, So this, the idea of uniting all German-speaking populations within one empire. And well, there's a quite famous quotation of one of them. If we only could already belong to Germany, that was the Bismarck, the empire of William II. So the idea of Habsburg, of the monarchy, that is completely not in line with Nazi thinking. But obviously, they supposed it would work with the local population. And I think this is the only justification you can find for their propaganda to stress this aspect. But if you look at the newspapers published during these 2 years, and even at the radio program, this is a recurrent topic. Just in order to organize collaboration as long as it is possible.
And was it successful in any way at the Trieste region or at ex-Habsburg possessions?
Well, not exactly, let's say, among the big mass of the population, but there have been groups of industrialists, of the economy, of economic leader of Trieste, which were quite in favor of not exactly Trieste passing under Germany, but of establishing strong links between Trieste and Germany. Indeed, Trieste had lost a great part of its importance and rule after 1918. It became just one of the many ports of Italy where it has been the only and important harbor of the Austrian monarchy. So there have been some sympathies, and there were also some sympathies towards Nazi anti-Semitism. There were quite aggressive fascist Italian groups favoring these ideas already before that area passed under German occupation. But on the other side, if you look at the strength of the armed resistance against German occupation, you will see that it had hardly any success.
Thank you for your comment. And the second question is about the map we saw in your presentation. It was a map showing the Austrian Alpenländer. I'm interested, is it a pure geographical denomination, or was it an idea of a specific historical cultural region of the Austrian Alps?
No, I don't think so. It is just grouping these provinces within, or labeling with a specific term. I don't remember where I took that map from, but I think it's from a series of maps showing not only Austria, but no, I don't think that has anything to do with. I don't even recall any such idea from the Habsburg monarchy of grouping these countries or these provinces, which actually have quite a different identity, I think. For example, if you think about the case of Tyrol, which was split up in 1918, one part passing under Italy, the others remaining with Austria, but the Austrian parts of Tyrol were split up. There was Northern Tyrol and East Tyrol, and after 1938, East Tyrol was, let's say, annexed by Carinthia, and this didn't work with the local identity feelings.
Thank you, Michal, for your lecture. I would like to ask you about there is a big debate in Poland on the term post-German. It is connected to so-called regained territories on the western part of Poland. And so we have post-German schools, German names in post-German villages, post-German documents, post-German things from everyday life. And I would like to ask about the term post-Habsburg. Does it exist in general? And what would it mean? What would it be? Post-Habsburg heritage, post-Habsburg legacy nowadays?
Well, it is not too easy a question to answer. But my feeling is that it is always used by or for political purposes. You have a revival of Habsburg, let's say, sentiments in the Trentino area, where you will find the so-called Schützen, which at least in South Tyrol and in North Tyrol are very far right-winged, non-governmental, extra-governmental political powers in favor, obviously, of bringing South Tyrol back to Austria. And you have these Schützen today nearly in every small village of former Italian-speaking Tyrol, demanding for a more intensive autonomy. And I'm not going to say that this is a kind of Habsburg monarchy, but you will find in certain areas of, especially of Tyrol, carnival events with people dressed as the emperor. But this is not exactly what you have been referring to. I think you were referring to cultural links. Well, nowadays I think it is to some degree, but always for the same topic, highly appreciated or held in a quite high esteem. How you would label it? Initially, I thought you were referring to the interwar period, whether there were links or continuities, and how were they labeled. You talked about post-German, the term of post-German used in let's say, Polish administrative language appears also. Is that right? This aspect is regarding the 1945 border and the territories annexed to Poland after 1945. In Italy, this was a phenomenon labeled with Austriacantismo. Those, well, still having Austrian sentiments, those not being satisfied under Italian rule. This was a big category of people. You'll find entire dossiers on a lot of people labeled as and persecuted as Austria, or having Austriacantismo feelings. As the culture is concerned, it has mostly been, I think, in the research done over the last decades, a topic treated by scholars of literature, of stressing the links between the German cultural area and especially Trieste. Stressing and deducing from studies on literature this link between former Austria and Trieste being part of it. But I'm not sure whether this is a general feeling or whether this is simply a phenomenon found in, let's say, in cultural elite.
I'd like to add something more. I forgot to share with you one anecdote, but it's good because it refers to the previous question. I used to travel in southern Poland. I love mountains. I've been to Lviv, Ukraine. I've been to Czechia, Slovakia, Austria, Hungary. I was on Erasmus in Slovenia, Croatia, northern Serbia. So almost all ex-Habsburg monarchy. And what I also graduated at Warsaw University of Technology on spatial planning. So I'm, let's say, architectural sensitive. And what I noticed is that, first of all, in Europe, the biggest group of the oldest buildings is built in the second part of 19th century. We can hardly find any bigger amount of buildings from the previous eras. And when you're Krakow, Lviv, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Subotica, Zagreb, etc., Ljubljana, Trieste, I can feel almost like in Krakow, Poland. Even, the theater in Krakow and Zagreb looks almost the same. I think that I have to investigate it, but I think the same guy built it. Also, opera in Lviv. So this is for sure something that is post-Habsburg heritage. Also, what I noticed is Schnitzel wiedeński, I mean Wiener Schnitzel, Dunajski zrejzek in Slovenian. And one thing that I wanted to mention before is that once me and my friends were on vacation in this part of Italy with Florence.
Tuscany?
Tuscany, yes, Tuscany, thank you. And we traveled for 2 weeks on Florence, and during our journey back, I wanted to visit Trieste, as I knew that I could find there some parts that looks like Krakow, Poland. And I didn't, I was not surprised. I found this city really well, and I asked my friend, so how did you like all those cities? Because for me, Trieste was the best. I love harbors, I love cities, etc. Also, this architecture looked good for me. And he told me, no, I prefer those Italian ones. Yeah, but because I think it was really noticeable, let's say, in Trieste, in this architectural aspect. And I think that, this footprint, let's say, is not easy to remove from this part of Europe.
Sure, you have the buildings, but one would have to look at the program